Hello there. My name is Brian Cheatham with Get Cloud Savvy. I don't know about you, but I am constantly trying to find out where to configure features and settings in Microsoft 365. There are dozens of admin portals and thousands of settings to configure. And don't even get me started on the constant movement of these settings when Microsoft changes their interfaces. So I'm on a quest for knowledge to figure out where the most common Microsoft 365 settings are configured. And guess what? I'm bringing you along for the ride. I've started a YouTube series called Where Do I Do That? In this series, I'll show you where to configure different settings and, most importantly, what the expected end-user experience will be. So let's get to it. Next up in this video series, Where Do I Do That? We are digging into the recommended OneDrive Sync App configuration. In the last video, we explored the configuration and end-user experience for Windows Autopilot. We discussed there is a handoff behind the scenes from Windows Autopilot to Intune. Windows Autopilot is responsible for joining the device to Azure Active Directory. The device is automatically enrolled into Intune, which allows you to manage devices and push specific configurations from the cloud. In this video, we'll review how to configure the OneDrive Sync App and the expected end-user experience. Let's start with an overview of the OneDrive Sync App. The OneDrive Sync App allows users to sync files from their local workstation to OneDrive for Business, SharePoint, and Microsoft Teams in the cloud and vice versa. When a user creates a new folder or modifies a file, the changes are synced to the cloud. The Files on Demand feature creates a placeholder for cloud-based files to conserve disk space on the local workstation. When a user accesses the cloud-based file via the placeholder, the file is downloaded to the local workstation. At this point, the user can edit the downloaded file locally and edit even while offline. Once the internet connection is reestablished, the changes to the file will be synchronized to the cloud. And users are used to saving documents and images to their local documents and pictures folders on their local workstation. These known folders can be redirected to OneDrive for Business in the cloud, which serves as a cloud backup for these files. This feature is also very handy when a user moves between computers or their computer is getting refreshed. The default OneDrive Sync App configuration requires a user to type their Microsoft 365 email address in order to link their local workstation with OneDrive for Business. In this video, we will demonstrate how you can configure the OneDrive Sync App to sync automatically and silently in the background. Let's take a quick look at the agenda for this video. So first, we want to talk about the lab environment. How do you build a lab environment that lets you demonstrate OneDrive Sync App? So we're going to go through that. Then we're going to look at where do you actually configure OneDrive Sync App settings? Where is this done? So where do I do that? And then finally, we're going to take a look at the actual expected end-user experience. So what's going to happen whenever we change these configuration settings or we set these configuration settings? What is the expected end-user experience? So let's take a look at the lab environment. Our lab environment is actually a Microsoft 365 business tenant, and we're using the Microsoft Customer Digital Experience, or CDX. Then we also have Microsoft 365 Business Premium licensing in this particular tenant. So it's recommended that we have this licensing so we have access to all the more advanced features that Business Premium brings. Azure AD Premium or Microsoft Entra ID Premium Plan 1, Intune, and those sort of things. And then finally, Windows 11 Pro. We need a Windows 11 Pro license. It's required for cloud management. And we are running that Windows 11 Pro workstation on a Hyper-V virtual machine. You can use another cloud solution or something like that to host the VM. In this case, we're using Hyper-V locally on our workstation. And then we need this Windows 11 Pro workstation to already be Azure AD joined and enrolled in Intune. So we're actually going to be using the workstation that we used in the last video for Windows Autopilot. So it's going to show you the complete handoff from Windows Autopilot all the way through to joining it to Azure AD and then enrolled in Intune and application of policies. So let's jump into the demo environment here. So we're looking at the recommended OneDrive Sync App configuration. So the first thing that we want to do is we actually want to take a look and review a document that's on the learn.microsoft.com website, which talks about the recommended sync app configuration. Okay, so this is a great article because this is directly related to the recommendations from Microsoft. So the first thing that we want to look at is updates and rings. So the sync client itself needs to be updated on a regular basis. Microsoft is constantly making changes in the background to improve the performance of this particular app and also to fix any bugs that they have or anything like that. So we want to make sure that that's up to date, okay? And then we want to look at files on demand and storage since. So files on demand, we talked about that a little bit. Files on demand basically conserve space on your local workstation if you're using the OneDrive Sync client. If you download a bunch of information from OneDrive for Business to your local workstation, you could start to run out of local disk space. So what Storage Sense does is basically an application that runs in Windows that will automatically run in the background, like every 30 days. You can actually configure it. We're going to go through those settings, but it goes through and cleans up things like your downloaded files. That always gets very large on people when they're downloading files all day, every day from the internet. That downloads folder just fills up. And then the other thing we want to look at too is anything that hasn't been accessed by OneDrive, we can actually revert that back to a placeholder. Okay, so we're going to take a look at those two configurations together. And then finally, we want to look at two other things. The silent account configuration. So remember, we said that by default, you have to type an email address into the OneDrive Sync app. What we want to do is make sure that since we're Azure AD joined, we want that user's account to automatically or silently configure in the background. So when the OneDrive Sync client launches, it's actually automatically configured for the end user. So it saves time, troubleshooting that needs to be done or anything like that. Well, hopefully there's no troubleshooting that needs to be done, but the idea of it is to configure that for the user the first time, so an administrator doesn't have to do that. And then finally, we talked about the known folder move. So that's taking the folders like desktop, pictures, documents, all those local folders, and we're redirecting those to OneDrive for Business. So if you already have documents or pictures on your laptop or workstation, and then you add the OneDrive Sync client to it and configure the managed backup, it will basically upload those files to OneDrive for Business. So it's a way of backing up that information. So we can automatically configure that to happen on a new workstation or one that we're setting up for OneDrive Sync client for the first time. So let's start off by logging in as a global admin to our Microsoft 365 Admin Center. Okay, we're going to scroll down here and we're going to start with Endpoint Manager. So where do I do that? We're doing this in Endpoint Manager. We're configuring a device configuration profile. So under Endpoint Manager, we go to Devices, and then we go all the way down to Configuration Profiles. And this is where we want to create a new profile. And you kind of notice how we're naming these. We want to group these together the best logical way that we can to where we don't have independent settings for and configuration profiles for every little setting we have out there, right? We want to try and group these as much as possible. So I'm going to create a profile. We're creating a Windows 10 and later profile. And my profile type, I'm going to say templates. Okay. And then under here, I'm going to select administrative templates and click create. So now I can give this a name. So I'm actually going to say OneDrive standard settings. Okay. These are the recommended settings for the OneDrive Sync app. Okay. Now we have some sort of description there. Click Next. And in configuration settings, there's a couple things we want to search for here. First, we talked about the update ring, right? So what I like to do here is I like to just click on all settings here at the top, and then just start typing here in this search dialog. So set the sync app. Okay, there we are. Set the sync app update ring. So let's go ahead and click this. We're going to enable. And we want the production, I can say that, production ring, okay? Production will get the latest features as they become available. So we're gonna say okay to that. And we're gonna come back in here, kind of clear this out, and we're gonna look for the second setting, which is going to be use files on demand. So the next setting that we want is use OneDrive files on demand. So I'm gonna type use OneDrive files on demand. So notice how that comes up here. Click on this. We're going to say enabled. It's going to force us to use the files on demand. All right. And then our next configuration setting is we want to silently sign in users. So silently sign in. Oop. There we go. Silently sign in users to OneDrive. This one right here. Okay, we'll enable that. Remember, this setting is going to automatically configure OneDrive for the user that's signed in to Microsoft 365 or Azure AD. Okay. All right. And then the next one is we want to silently move known folders. Okay, notice how there's two versions here. I recommend that you always use the higher version. Microsoft is always working on improving these administrative templates, so I do recommend that you select the highest version. So in this case, 2.0, silently move Windows known folders to OneDrive. So notice when we enable this, we have something that we can select down here. So it populates the tenant ID for us, and then it can show the user a notification. So we're not worried about that. But what I do want to do here, I usually recommend this just because some people like to keep a lot of things on their desktop and it can cause refresh issues and whatnot. So I kind of uncheck desktop unless we absolutely need it. But that's something that I would recommend for now. If you're looking at moving from a workstation like an on-prem AD join to an Azure AD join and you want to back up a desktop, this is definitely a way you can back up the desktop. So we can check it in that case. In this case, I'm not going to check it. So now we've got that configured. And the next one we want to look at is we want to look at a few other ones that aren't recommended in the article that we just looked at, but based on just our experience with OneDrive Sync app and all of that, there's a few others that we recommend you set as well. So the first thing that we want to set is enable automatic upload bandwidth. So what this is actually doing is it's basically telling the OneDrive Sync client to kind of throttle its upload. If you look up here in the top, it's powered by this LEDBAT, low extra delay background transport protocol, kind of similar to his bits, but this is an upload. This is a way to conserve bandwidth whenever maybe the client is using too much bandwidth on the network. Okay, so we're going to enable this. And then we want to look at a couple of more settings here. So the first one is we want to prompt users when they delete multiple files in OneDrive. So what can tend to happen here is a user will go into an area that is synchronized to OneDrive via the OneDrive Sync App, and they delete something, a folder. And maybe that folder, they didn't want to delete it, and it's got over 100 items or something like that, and it's an oopsie, right? We're going to set this, and we're going to demonstrate how it works. Normally, I would say set it to 100 or 200 files, but in this case, just so you can see how this works, we're going to say 10. Kind of get where we're going with this. And then finally, the last thing we want to do is we want to require users to confirm large delete operations, okay? Again, we're within this OneDrive, we're still working on the OneDrive Sync app, but what this is going to do is just prompt the user to say, hey, are you sure you want to do this? Just a kind of a quick way to validate with the user. I can go in here and I can get rid of everything that I have here in my search items, and I can see all of these settings that I just enabled. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them in total. So now we'll click next. We're not using scope tags here, so we'll click next. And then for assignments, I'm just going to go ahead and say add all devices. By adding all devices, I'm basically saying anything that's an Azure AD join that has been enrolled in Intune, I want to be a part of this policy. Okay, we can do other things, more specific to a set of group of devices or something like that. Like for example, I could say, hey, all Windows 10 and 11 devices get this setting or these configuration settings. But for now, we're just going to say all devices. It shows us everything that we've configured. We're going to say create, and that's going to go create our device configuration profile. So that takes care of our OneDrive standard settings. But remember, we also talked about configuring storage sense. So Windows storage sense. So I'm going to create a new profile here. Go down to Windows 10 or later. This time I'm selecting settings catalog. Okay, create. Give this a name here. We'll call this storage sense standard settings. These are the recommended storage sense settings alongside OneDrive Sync App. Okay, we'll say next. For configuration settings, we're going to click Add Settings. And then I can search for a string. So I'm going to search for storage. Okay. If I search here, it should give me everything that has storage. I'm going to select storage. And this is where I get all of the different settings that I can set as part of storage sense. Okay. So I'm going to just select all of these settings. We're going to go through and kind of remove the ones that we don't need. But I'm going to select all of these and notice how it displays kind of the different settings that you can set here. So we're not worried about this first setting here, remove disk deny write access. Not worried about this. On the dehydration threshold, this is something that we do want to set. So I'm going to set this to 30 days. And you can kind of look at the default settings for storage sense to get an idea of how you would set these. And then as far as cadence is concerned, we can actually leave this value of 0. And what that's going to do is whenever the disk space is running low, it will basically do the cleanup. Okay, so if I just kind of hover over here, you'll see that during low free disk space, the default is 0, which means that's the only time that it's going to run. We can set it for 7 days if we want to do that, but in this case, we're just going to set it to 0. So whenever we're running low on disk space, it'll clean up for us. And then downloads, we're going to do 30 days here. If you wanted, you could do 60 days on something like this. Okay, and then the last thing we want to do is we want to allow storage sense global. Actually, I want to leave the temporary files cleanup, and I can remove this here at the bottom. So really, these are the only settings that we're looking at. It's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 settings. Okay, so we're going to say next. We're not worried about scope tags. And then assignments, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to say add all devices. So all devices is all Azure AD joined devices that are enrolled in Intune. Next, I can review my settings here, and then we'll create. So now we have both of our settings, so OneDrive standard settings and our Storage Sense standard settings. So now let's take a look at what the end user experience will be with these configuration settings configured the way they are. So now that we've configured the device configuration profiles, we want to see what the expected end user experience will be like for OneDrive Sync App. So let's take a look. So I'm going to bring up my VM here, make this full screen. And I'm going to sign in as Alex W. So this is going to sign me in for the first time. Be just like I'm booting up from an autopilot type of experience. All right, now that I've signed in, I'm going to take a look down here in the systray and ensure that the OneDrive Sync client was actually enabled. And in fact, it was. So it was silently configured in the background. I didn't have to type my email address or anything like that. Let's get rid of Teams here for a minute. So it automatically or silently configured the OneDrive Sync app for me. So let's just take a peek at the settings here, right? Because we had some settings that we configured. So first thing we did is we said we want to configure OneDrive. So we configure OneDrive. It's got our account in there. We didn't have to type an email address or anything like that. And then next, we configured files on demand. So notice how I can't select download all files here. The other thing we configured is we configured the managed backup. We talked about the known folders. We configured it for documents and for pictures. If I wanted to add desktop, I could add it here. But in this case, we're not adding desktop. And then finally, we had the adjust automatically. So we're managed by your organization. So this is that enabled that upload bandwidth setting that we were talking about. So these are all the OneDrive sync features, and we're going to look at one more here in a second. But before we do that, we're going to just check our storage sense. So I'm going to go into storage settings. And I want to make sure that storage sense is actually on, which it is. And notice how it's grayed out here, so the user can't turn it off. And then here's my different settings that I have here. Maximize this to make it a little bigger. I've already have it set here, right? So we're managing this policy via the device configuration in Intune. So the user doesn't have the ability to change these settings. Only run during low free disk space. 30 days for our recycle bin, 30 days for the downloads folder, and also content will become online only when open for more than 30 days, okay? So that's kind of the order that it goes in, but notice how we have all the storage sense settings configured. All right, so the last thing that we want to test is we want to test the delete threshold, okay? So I'm going to open up File Explorer, maximize this to give us some more real estate. I'm going to go to OneDrive and then to Documents. So I basically just took a test file and I created a bunch of these out here. So I'm going to select all of these files. Look at how these are cloud-only files right now. So I'm selecting something that would sync. It's a delete operation locally that would sync to OneDrive. So if I click delete, it's going to warn me, hey, are you sure you want to do this? Sure you want to do this before sending them? I'm going to go ahead and say yes, because I'm not really thinking. I'm just going to click yes. And then there's a second protection mechanism here. So if I look, I actually have an exclamation point on OneDrive. If I go in and look at the settings, I can see that it's actually asking me, are you sure you want to delete these files? You know, if you meant to do this, then you can remove them now. So this is just another protection mechanism from deleting files, because if you delete something locally that's synced with OneDrive via the OneDrive Sync App, it will delete the files from the cloud. This concludes our video on where do I do that. Please return the favor by liking this video or leaving a comment if you have any questions or would like to see us cover another topic in the future. Please subscribe and click the notification to receive updates on future posts.